thank you so much for having me. And this is only the second time I've been involved at a GSN event. It's the first time I've spoken at one, so very, very pleased to be here and to meet all the different types of people and to feature in this academic session. I had hoped to sort of use this kind of remit in this brief to communicate what I think would be good ideas for government and some kind of pointers for business and government in terms of how to improve labour standards and tackle conditions that give rise to slavery. I think what I'm going to do is kind of give a speeded up version of what it is I've been looking at over the last few years, and similar to the last talk, kind of start this with a little bit of a kind of debrief on how I think academia can help in this area and how research can inform new ways of working, new ways of inspecting. But also, I think to try and do something slightly different in terms of trying to get academics to think a little bit differently about the challenge of tackling modern slavery and labour law enforcement. So I first really got into this area. I should say I work at Queen's University Belfast, and if you do want to follow up with me, please just take a note of my email. Please do get in touch. I really value speaking to people, not just in academia but outside of it as well. But I first got involved in this area doing research for the International Labour Organization while I was a research associate at the University of Sheffield some years ago. And this was a project called Strengthening Labour Administration, which really involved doing some reports for the ILO onto what they broadly consider to be this labour administration area, under which labour inspection falls. So this kind of requirement of government to try and put in place enforcement teams to uphold labour standards, go and do inspections, go and see how workplaces are adhering to rules and regulations. And as part of this project, myself and the leader of the project, Jason Hayes at University of Sheffield, we developed a training toolkit and we did a lot of interviews with labour inspectors and other state professionals who are broadly involved in labour standards enforcement and labour administration. We actually did a pilot of it. So we produced this what we call the trainer's handbook, really for as a resource on behalf of the ILO that could be rolled out for labour inspectors in different national contexts with a view to them better policing what goes on in quite hidden areas and areas specifically relating to the informal economy. So we delivered kind of pilots of this in Carlow in Ireland, where the main labour inspection unit is based, the WRC, and in 2 locations in South Africa, so Rustenburg and Durban. What I want to focus on relatively quickly is some of the kind of academic offshoots of this. So we have, this was actually put forward as an impact case study in Sheffield. Sorry, I keep changing the slides, don't I? You're trying to take photos, sorry. This was put forward as a kind of impact case study. We did harvest some data from this, and I think some of this kind of anecdotal data, it's hard to measure impact sometimes, but it was to do in large part, I think, with new sites of inspection taking place that they hadn't typically thought of inspecting before, that can be quite hard to locate. So outside of that direct impact, since that period of time, I've really tried to harvest the data that I have, which is largely qualitative interviews, more than 50 qualitative interviews with different individuals involved in labour administration. And the main outputs are on the screen there. So I had a paper a few years ago looking at labour standards in South African wine, the Leveraging Nordic Links paper. I have a chapter which is ongoing, which looks at the state and the links with what's called labour geography and labour inspection, and a recent paper that's been out this year, which I've called Exploring Labour's Role Working Against, with and through the state to improve labour standards. And what I've really tried to do with this is it's not so much impact in the field as such with these papers. I'm more speaking to an academic audience with this and trying to get people to think kind of theoretically different about how we process things like global production networks, global value chains, and the role of workers within them. And in particular, I was faced with this really quite gloomy prospect, because while I was doing this research for the ILO on labour inspection, in many of the cases, what you're uncovering and what many of the experts in the room will be aware of is the state often doesn't prioritize labour inspection. There's not enough money put into it. There's not enough labour inspectors. Alongside the other challenges that we know with tackling modern slavery, there's this kind of under-prioritization of the state's role tackling labour exploitation through labour inspectorates. So I'm just going to skim over what the aims of these papers were. The first one really looks at South African wine, challenges with the labour inspectorate there, which led to a role for a multi-stakeholder initiative doing a lot of the work to try and leverage more attentions on exploitation in South African wine. The second paper, which came out this year, is more focused on the UK and Ireland. So again, drawing on the initial case study project, the country case studies from the ILO-funded work. And this has got some sort of different ways in which I think worker groups in particular have engaged with the state. I don't want to talk too much about theory here, but essentially the first paper, what I really focused on here was trying to open up this framework that's known as the Global Production Network Framework, which is really seen as a way through which companies spread their operations around the globe. So if you're thinking about something like South African wine, for example, you may be thinking about the kind of vineyards themselves and the labour that works on these vineyards. You're then talking about the brands that put a label on the wine, that ship the wine. It then ends up in a store. And in South Africa, many of the stores that the wine ends up in are actually in Europe. And my particular focus on this was on Scandinavian markets, and I'll come on to that soon. But what I was particularly interested in was this kind of third bullet point here about this radicalizing trend in GPN research, because what I focused on was not only these connections between different industry groups, but actually the connections that happen with labour and the workers there, and in particular connections between trade union, civil society and charity groups in places like Sweden and Norway and counterparts that were operating in South Africa, which led to some really quite interesting research findings. The organisation that I ended up looking at here was called VITA. So in red here, you'll see the Department of Labour had only just one inspector for every 120,000 economically active citizens, a figure which compares really unfavourably to the ILO's recommended rate of one for every 20,000. So when I was looking at South Africa as a case study of labour inspection, essentially you're looking at a dearth of labour inspectors for the activities which are going on there. Then when I narrowed it down to a sector such as wine, this was a really interesting sector because there were these groups that were really interested in this. In particular, the Ethical Trade Initiative had a links to creating an organisation called VITA. Now this was a non-profit voluntary association of stakeholders. It had all sorts of different people on the board. So it had industry actors, it had unions, it had civil society organisations and women's groups. And the purpose of VITA was really to kind of plug this gap from the Department of Labour in some respects. So it was actually getting these companies to do voluntary certification schemes, the thinking being that if these organisations have signed up to this code and they're delivering on it, there's less of a kind of need to be too concerned that they're breaking regulations. So the VITA code, for instance, it modelled many of its attributes on key ILO conditions, the right to a living wage, unfair discrimination, etc. Lots of conditions that should have made these wine farms very agreeable. Now, to cut a longer story short, essentially what happened here was there was a lot of upset when I spoke with stakeholders that in fact industry was using this group VITA to actually cover up a lot of the bad practices that were happening. The State Labour Inspectorate was not policing conditions here very well, was the narrative. And there were a lot of practices which people were likening to slavery. There was still the maintenance of old colonial type systems, workers allegedly still being paid in alcohol, for example. Workers were very removed and remote from the intentions of enforcement agencies. And essentially what happened here was that many of these groups that were involved on this board, they had connections to other groups In particular, there was this organization, Kasawu. They got involved in this big international pressure group, the Ethical Wine Trade Campaign, and they mobilized tensions with like-minded stakeholders in Sweden and Norway. Now, those countries were really relevant for two reasons. Okay, so one of the reasons was this was a major market for the South African wine. But the other reason was, I don't know, has anyone been to Sweden or Norway and tried to buy alcohol? They've got these state monopolies, yeah. So you have Systembolaget and Vinmonopoly. So when you go into shops selling alcohol, it's essentially a government agency, and they have a much bigger remit than a typical off-license does. So the government essentially started to get very involved, potentially with this. There was a lot of pressure put on, and the upshot of this, there was also a major documentary that came out at the time by a Scandinavian filmmaker. But the upshot of this was the Swedish alcohol monopolies, they put a lot of pressure on Vita to improve the audits that they were doing, and they developed more sophisticated risk matrices, etc. And in addition to this, a lot more pressure on the Labour Inspectorate to police standards better and conduct more assessments. So the conclusion of this, what I wanted to show from a theoretical point of view, was that you had these connections between these different stakeholders. It wasn't just companies doing business together across these global networks. The global production network was in itself a platform for these different worker groups and these different agencies to get involved and improve labour standards. The second paper, this more recent paper, okay, this was a paper which focused more on the UK and Ireland in terms of what is going on with other third-party groups. Again, my real interest here became one of looking at what's going on. I'm saying that the state is struggling to police labour standards. It's struggling to tackle modern slavery. It's struggling to uphold workers' rights. One of our interests here when we were developing the toolkit was looking at different academic theories of regulation, and you can see these in the box here. So typically, what the ILO itself actually encourages is what's known as a compliance-based approach to regulation. So when we talk about labour inspection, very often what's happening is you have an ideology through which the Labour Inspectorate is encouraged to try and work with producers, work with the firms if they're having problems living up to their obligations with workers. They're encouraged to develop systems and ways of working with them. And it's a relatively light touch kind of ideology compared to something more aggressive like punitive fines or sanctions, etc. So we have to remember that. We have to think about that from an ideological point of view. There's this onus on encouraging compliance rather than punishing firms in many instances. Now, there's other theories that inform regulatory approaches. So we have things like risk-based regulation. So, for example, if you're operating with limited resources, you may target those resources on particular sectors that are assumed to have high risks. You may identify these risks to their objectives and focus resources upon these that are most critical. Another cost-effective means of regulating firms, it could be to develop what's known as meta-regulation approaches. So these encourage the development and assessment of a firm's own internal control and audit systems. And then the regulator can come and just check that, okay, you've got the system in place, that's how you're going to tackle those issues. You then have something known as responsive regulation. So this is, again, it's a way of managing your resources. Regulators escalate or de-escalate interventions based upon the perceived response of the regulatee. So if you visit a firm and it's not developed pay slips, for example, or it's not got a good HR system, it might be that they get some sort of warning. We come back, if they've addressed that, they may get moved to the bottom of the pile again or given a kind of green light. If they've not, they may move up the sanction pyramid. And then finally, we have what I was particularly interested in, which is this notion of smart regulation. And this is a way of conducting regulation which combines a range of what's known as innovative forms of control. It often involves third parties operating to some degree as surrogate regulators and doing the job of the state for them. And what the Cunningham and Sinclair really did a good piece on this. They talk about using complementary combinations of instruments and participants which are intended to accomplish public policy goals more effectively. So quite often doing more with less is what's part of the thinking there. Something I wanted to sort of touch on here is just how messy the institutional landscape is in the UK in particular when we're trying to tackle labour abuses. Okay, so we have so many different teams and agencies that are involved here. We have a national minimum wage enforcement team, an employment agency standards inspectorate, health and safety executive, which is important in a labour inspection capacity. And we have the Gangmasters Licensing and Labour Abuse Authority, which was the main focus of my research. Now, interestingly, this authority was given an enhanced remit in in 2017. It was given effectively what's known as police-style powers. Labour abuse prevention officers were created, this capacity to give a kind of bigger stick to non-compliant firms. But in practice, there's a lot of legislative gaps here. So there needs to be a certain level of criminality that's been established before the GLAA can actually go and enter a premises. And this creates huge, huge problems. You've also got the National Crime Agency, obviously, for we're investigating criminal cases. In Ireland, the situation is slightly different. So they also have different agencies, but these were subsumed through the Workplace Relations Act into one unified workplace relations commissions. Now, the thing again I want to stress here is there's incredibly low levels of staffing here for what's recommended and advised. So the GLAA, when I was writing this up in 2001, it had between 150 and 124, including vacancies that were advertised. WRC had just 53 inspectors for the whole of the Irish economy. So these organisations have specific remits, but these are still incredibly low numbers. You can't really think that they're going to police all the problems there. Again, ILO benchmarking 1 inspector for every 10,000 workers. So this led me to think, gosh, are they doing lots of smart regulation? Are they doing lots of these different approaches here to work more with less? What I found here was a kind of really, really mixed picture. You had to some extent some coordination with different groups. So the GLAA in particular had these quarterly liaison group meetings. They would speak to the TUC, other unions, charities. The WRC said that they did similar things in Ireland. But again, there was real problems here straight away. We're talking about very mixed messages. So in Ireland, the Migrant Rights Centre, who play a really big role there representing migrants, they voiced a real distrust with the authorities there. There was this sense that migrants were actually getting in trouble when they were in situations of exploitation. The authorities were focusing more on why they were there when they shouldn't be there, rather than the actual exploitation and the suffering that they were enduring. And indeed, if you look at WRC reports, you know, it is quite shocking how much of the kind of auditing that takes place there is focusing on people who have and firms that have fallen foul of Employment Permit Act legislation, rather than focusing on really egregious cases of exploitation. Where am I going with this? I don't think I've got too much time to focus on this, so I'm going to skip that example. I found speaking with many people in this room really, really helpful from this point of view. So, for example, I had these cases of kind of third parties that were kind of what I've said were working against the state. They were flagging really big problems with the state. They were campaigning. They managed to change some rights and situations of people working on boats in Ireland, and change some legislation through again, engaging with media contacts. We had the Guardian speaker earlier, really, really, really important. The second case I looked at here was more with working with the state, and I was focusing on examples such as the South Marshall Group, the work that they do connecting different churches, faith-based organisations, and engaging with regulatory bodies, the Cluer Initiative, and the work on developing the Safe Car Wash app and the agricultural variants of this. Really, really important in terms of helping connect some of these high-risk cases with people like the GLAA, national crime agencies, etc. The thinking being here that you know, the limited resources that some of these state bodies have, they really need help in gathering data, and that third parties, faith-based groups, etc., have a really, really big, important role here, and I think people need to give that credit and be aware of this. And then finally, I focused on what I call working through the state, and I focused here on some of the interviews that I did with people who work or used to work in the inspection role or for the equivalent of a labour standards enforcement agency. So we've got cases of, for example, whistleblowing, where you know there's a kind of landmark case in the Republic of Ireland on a particular inspector who was basically voicing his frustration at the focus of the WRC, and that they weren't focusing on really egregious offences that were taking place. But also more positively, there were lots of really creative initiatives, individuals in the GLAA, for example, joining up with major supermarkets like Tesco's, trying to develop schemes such as the Responsible Car Wash scheme, which provided an accreditation for certain groups who were part of this membership scheme. The key thing for the standards enforcement here was that it gave someone like the GLAA access to a site which would previously have been considered a domestic space or a space that they couldn't have access to, so it facilitated them getting access to do inspections. So lots of creative things happening in what I think is, I'm just going to finish on this slide, what I think is a really difficult environment right now, and I think one of the big subjects here that we need to be upset about and to acknowledge is just how right-wing a lot of our politics is right now, and in particular the way that we look at migration, the narrative around small boats, the narrative on people who should or shouldn't be here, and I think this has really taken the eye off what these inspectorate units were meant to be doing, the exploitation they were meant to be driving out. These units were really set up, if you look at the GLA, it was set up on the back of Morecambe Bay disaster and the death of Chinese cockle pickers there. In Ireland, it was about migrant workers being brought into the country who were working in very difficult conditions. These services were meant to be there to try and improve working rights and drive out exploitation. And in the current political climate, it really does feel like there's a lot of orientation that's happened here towards more punitive, frankly non-appropriate purposes, which are geared to demonising migrants and playing a role which many people find extremely unpalatable, and there needs to be a kind of return to the initial remit of what these organisations were meant to be doing, and backing them, giving them the finance, giving them the resources, and actually looking at the ideology of the inspection and what we're trying to achieve with these units. Also certain loopholes. I had an Irish fishing case I never got into there, but essentially a lot of what's happened, in particular in the UK, there's been a lot of talk for a long time about subsuming our different inspection agencies under one umbrella. That seems to have been shelved along with a lot of other aspirations for labour inspection. But I'm going to finish there because I'm conscious that I've overrun, and thank you everyone. Thank you.